My son-in-law told me, standing in my own driveway, that they needed a real contractor for the addition, not somebody working out of a truck. 6 months later, at 11 o'clock at night in a thunderstorm, my phone rang and it was him, and water was coming through his light fixture, and I was the only real contractor he could think to call. Settle in, friend, because this one's about the difference between a license and a lifetime, and about a man who had to watch his own daughter's roof fail before anybody in that house remembered which one actually keeps the rain out. My name is Douglas Marsh. I'm 76 years old, and for 52 years I built things in this county that are still standing. And I want to tell you about the 6 months it took my son-in-law to learn what I already knew the day he married my daughter. Let me set the scene properly, because you need to understand what kind of builder I was before you understand what kind of insult it was to be told I wasn't one. I apprenticed at 18 in 1968 under a stonemason and general contractor named Ellery Voss, a man who wore a level clip to his belt the way other men wear a sidearm, and who used to say a house doesn't lie to you, son. It just waits until you're not looking to tell you the truth. Ellery was 44 then, and I was a skinny 18-year-old who thought carpentry was about being fast. And he cured me of that opinion inside of 1 week by having me tear out and rebuild the same 6 feet of stud wall 4 times. Not because I'd gotten it wrong exactly, but because he said wrong isn't the only standard a wall has to meet. Plumb is a promise too. And a promise you almost kept is still a promise you broke. I hated him a little that whole first year, friend. The honest way a young man hates anybody who's right about him too early, and I have missed him every working day since he passed. 11 years back now, at 91, still able to read a level at 10 paces without touching it. I got my own general contractor's license at 24 in 1974, the same year I married my Carol, and the two of us started Marsh Construction out of a rented garage bay with one used flatbed truck and a business loan her father cautioned against his own better judgment. God rest him. I spent the next 46 years building additions, restorations, and when the jobs came big enough, commercial work, all across this county under a company name that still hangs, faded now, on a sign in my own barn. Marsh Construction. I want you to know the kind of work I mean, because it matters later. In 1991, when I was 41 years old, the county hired Marsh Construction to build the East Wing addition onto the historical museum downtown, field stone facing, hand-laid, matched to stone quarried out of a pit that's been closed for 60 years. And I laid a good part of that wall myself, on my knees with my own hands, because I did not trust any of my crew, good as they were, to match old stone the way I could. That wall is still there, friend. You can walk up and run your palm along it right now, and it will still be plumb, and it will still be true, and it will outlive every person reading this sentence. I am not telling you this to brag. I am telling you this because 6 months ago, my son-in-law stood in my driveway and told me I wasn't a real contractor, and I want you to have some idea of what that sentence had to climb over to reach me. I'll give you one more building before I move on, because it matters to how the rest of this story lands. In 1988, Marsh Construction won the bid, against 2 outfits twice my size, to put a new roof and structural addition on the county hospital's east wing, 41,000 square feet, union crews, 6 months of inspections from a building department that did not know my name yet and treated me like they expected me to fail. We did not fail. That roof is still up there today, 38 years of winters on it, and the hospital's own facilities director told me at Ellery's funeral, unprompted, that it's the only original roof section on the whole building that's never needed emergency repair. I tell you both of these because I want you to understand, before Craig ever opens his mouth in this story, exactly how far a man has to fall to hear the word real used against him. Here's the part that's actually true, and I'll give my son-in-law that much credit before I give him anything else. I did let my commercial general contractor's license lapse. 6 years ago, when I turned 70 and my Carol had her first heart scare, a Tuesday morning, chest pains at the sink, an ambulance ride I still can't think about without my hands going cold, and it turned out to be a blockage caught early. Thank God. A stent and a change of diet and a scare that passed. But we sat down that same week at that same kitchen table where we'd sat down for 46 years by then. Carol's hand flat on the wood the way she does when she wants a decision to feel permanent. And she said, "Douglas, I need you on the ground more than I need you on a scaffold." And I looked at her, and I looked at the bond renewal paperwork sitting unopened on the counter. $6,000 a year by then for a commercial policy, up from $400 the year I started, and I signed the letter of non-renewal that same afternoon before I could talk myself out of it. I kept a residential contractor's license, capped by the state at smaller job values, enough for porches, decks, kitchen remodels, additions under a certain dollar figure. That's a fact. My son-in-law wasn't lying when he said it. He was just using a true fact to cover up an uglier one, and it took me a long while to untangle which part of what he said I was actually allowed to be hurt by. My daughter's name is Renee. She's 48 now, and she is, without 1 ounce of competition from anybody else on this earth, the best thing Carol and I ever built together, and I say that as a man who has built quite a lot. She married Craig Whitfield in 2001, 25 years ago this coming fall, and I liked him from the start, friend. I want to be honest about that too, because this isn't a story where the son-in-law was rotten from day one. He was 24 when I met him, fresh out of college, nervous as a cat asking me for Renee's hand at my own kitchen table, and I remember exactly what he said, because it's the thing that made me trust him for the next 25 years. He said, "Mr. Marsh, I don't know how to build anything with my hands, and I know that probably matters to a man like you, but I promise you I'll always know enough to hire the right people, starting with knowing that you're the right people." I built Renee and Craig's first house myself in 2003, a modest 3-bedroom on Larkspur Lane, and I built Renee a treehouse behind it that same summer for free out of leftover lumber from a job, because that's the rate I charge my own daughter, and Craig helped me nail the platform boards, clumsy but willing, and I thought, this is a man who knows what he doesn't know, which in my trade is the single most valuable thing a client can know about himself. Craig manages a regional insurance agency 2 towns over now, good at his job, good to my daughter, decent to their 2 boys, and for 23 of those 25 years, if you'd asked me to name one thing wrong with the man, I'd have come up dry. Renee and Craig decided last fall to add onto their house. A great room and a primary suite, 2 stories, tied into the existing structure on the north side. The kind of job that, back in my day, would have been exactly my size and exactly my specialty. And the kind of job I would have taken on for family at cost, materials and a fair day rate for myself and maybe one man, because that's what a father does. $238,400, the finished quote came to, when Craig finally told me the number, which was itself a piece of the insult, because he didn't tell me the number until after the contract was already signed with somebody else. I found out the way you find out the worst things in a family, friend, second-hand and sideways. I drove past their place on a Tuesday in January to drop off a fruitcake Carol had made, and there was a sign in the yard, professionally printed Coroplast, the kind that costs real money, and it said Sterling Premier Builders, licensed, bonded, 5-star rated, with a phone number and a little logo of a house with a halo over it. And friend, I want you to know exactly what that halo did to me. Because I have thought about it more than I should admit. I sat in my truck at the curb for a good 3 minutes before I could make myself drive the fruitcake up to the door. Renee answered, and she couldn't look at me straight, which told me everything before either of us said a word. And she said, "Dad, we should have told you," and I said, "Told me what, Renee?" and she got Craig. Because that's the kind of conversation neither of them wanted to have solo. And Craig came out onto the porch in his work clothes. And here is the sentence, word for word, that I have not been able to fully put down since. He said, "Doug, we needed a real contractor for a job this size. Somebody licensed for it, not somebody working out of a truck." I want to tell you honestly what happened inside me in that moment, because I think men my age don't say this part enough. It wasn't rage. Rage would have been almost a relief. It was the particular, quiet devastation of hearing the one identity you built your entire life around, spoken back to you by your own family, as a thing you apparently never were, not somebody working out of a truck. Friend, I built the wing of a public museum with my own 2 hands. I trained 11 apprentices who are still working in this county today, including a young man named Nate Correa, who I'll tell you more about shortly. I held, for 46 years, one of the cleanest commercial licenses the state board ever issued. Not one violation, not one lien, not one lawsuit. And I stood in my own daughter's driveway, holding a fruitcake, and got called not a real contractor by a man who sells insurance for a living and has never once, in 25 years, swung a hammer at anything harder than a picture hook. I didn't argue. I want you to know that because I'm not proud of much in this story, but I am proud of that. I asked one question, only one, because I owed it to myself to ask it plainly even if I already suspected the true answer underneath the license for it answer. I said, "Craig, is that the whole reason?" And he looked past me at my truck in the driveway. That same 20-year-old Ford, dented tailgate, faded lettering on the door that used to say Marsh Construction and now mostly says Arsh Construction. And he said, "It's a big job, Doug." The bank wanted certain assurances, and I heard everything he didn't say inside everything he did, and I said, "All right." And I put the fruitcake on the porch rail, and I got back in my truck, and I drove home, and I did not raise my voice, and I did not say one more word about it to Renee for 6 months, because some hurts, friend, you carry quiet, and you let the situation answer for itself, if you're patient enough to wait, which at 76 I finally am. Carol asked me that night, lying in bed, whether I was going to say anything more to Renee about it, and I told her no, and she was quiet a long moment and then said the thing that got me through the next 6 months without curdling. She said, "Douglas, you've spent 52 years building things that speak for themselves after you've gone home. Let this be one more of those." And I have thought about that sentence probably 400 times since. Now let me tell you a little about Sterling Premier Builders, because they matter almost as much to this story as Craig does. Owned by a man named Chad Sterling, mid-30s, 3 trucks wrapped in vinyl, a marketing budget bigger than most contractors' whole annual revenue in this county, a 5-star rating built, I found out later, largely on reviews from the first 90 days of every job, before anybody's roof has had one winter to prove itself. They were licensed. That part was true. Bonded, also true, on paper, the day the contract was signed. What Craig didn't know What none of them knew was that a license and a bond tell you a company cleared a bar on one particular Tuesday. They don't tell you a single thing about the Thursday 6 months later when the work actually gets tested. I met Chad Sterling exactly once, at the County Builders Association mixer that spring, an event I still go to out of habit more than usefulness, and he shook my hand with the particular firmness of a man who's practiced his handshake in a mirror. And when somebody introduced me as Doug Marsh, he said, "Oh, Marsh Construction, my dad used to talk about you." And I said, "Is that right?" And he said you were solid but slow, and laughed like it was a compliment, and moved on to the next hand before I could decide whether to be insulted or just tired. I found out later his father had never worked construction a day in his life. Chad had simply heard my name somewhere and built a story to fit the shape of the room he was standing in, which, now that I know him better through his work, tells you most of what you need to know about the whole operation. They broke ground the second week of January. Fast, friend, faster than I would have run that job, and I watched some of it happen from the road, because a man can't entirely stop driving past his own daughter's house, and I saw things that worried me and said nothing, because I had promised myself all right, and a man keeps his word even to himself, especially to himself. I saw the footing trenches poured shallower than I'd have poured them, in soil I know holds water worse than most soil in this county, because I've built on that exact street twice before, back when the subdivision first went in 1979. I saw the tie-in to the existing foundation done with what looked, from the road, like too few anchor bolts and no visible waterproofing membrane at the seam. I saw a framing crew that looked, respectfully, like very good carpenters who had never built anything that had to survive an actual winter in this specific kind of clay soil. And I said nothing, because it wasn't my job anymore, by Craig's own declaration, and I was not going to be the old man muttering unwanted advice at the fence line. The addition was finished by the end of March. Renee sent me pictures proud, and I looked at those pictures a long while, friend, because good work photographs beautifully and bad work photographs identically, for about the first year, which is the exact cruelty of this trade. Everything looks finished. Nothing has been tested yet. 6 months, friend. That's not a figure of speech in this story, that's the precise unit of time it took. I have to tell you about the drive-bys, because they're their own kind of quiet suffering, and I think anybody who's ever watched a mistake happen in slow motion, powerless to stop it because you've been told plainly it isn't your business, will recognize the shape of it. I drove that road to the feed store and back at least twice a week, same as I always had, and I watched Sterling's crew work through February and March. And I noticed things the way a doctor notices a limp in a stranger crossing the street, involuntary, trained into the eye by 52 years of looking. I noticed the framing crew broke for lunch at the same time every day regardless of what stage the pour was at, which told me they were working a schedule, not a sequence. And a house does not care about your schedule, friend. It only cares about your sequence. I noticed the dumpster stayed remarkably clean for a job that size, which meant either a very tidy crew or very little actual demolition and rework happening. And in this trade, a clean dumpster on somebody else's job has never once, in my experience, been the good kind of sign. Carol handled those 6 months better than I did, if I'm honest, because she'd had 30 extra years of practice biting her tongue around her own mother, and she took to bringing Renee small excuses to visit: a pie, a bag of tomatoes from the garden, anything that let her walk through that house and lay eyes on the work without ever once mentioning it, and she'd come home and tell me, in a voice flattened on purpose so I couldn't read too much into it, that the caulk line along the north wall looked a certain way, or that Renee had mentioned a smell she couldn't place. And I'd nod, and neither of us would say the thing out loud because we'd agreed that January night after the fruitcake that this one wasn't ours to fix unless we were asked. Carol has a harder patience than mine, friend, forged over 52 years of watching me swallow things I wanted to say on job sites. And she spent that whole spring quietly stockpiling worry the way she stockpiles canning jars, in neat rows, waiting. It started small, the way these things always do, and Renee told me about it afterward in pieces, the way people always tell you the truth after they've already lived through the parts that would have let them stop it earlier. In April, a door in the new great room started sticking, just a little, blamed on humidity, on the house settling on nothing in particular. In May, a hairline crack opened up along the seam where the new construction met the old house, running floor to ceiling, and Craig, God love him, caulked it himself and painted over it, because by then some small, stubborn part of him already suspected what it meant and didn't want to know for certain. In June, the primary suite's walk-in closet started smelling faintly, persistently, of something Renee described to me later as wet cardboard, and she opened the windows and lit a candle and told herself it would pass. And then came the 3rd of July, a Friday, the worst thunderstorm this county had seen in about 6 years, 2.5 inches in under 2 hours, and at 11:11 that night, Craig's name came up on my phone, and friend, I want you to know I still had that number saved from before all this. I never once considered deleting it, and I answered on the second ring. And Craig's voice was doing something I had genuinely never heard it do in 25 years, which was shake. He said, "Doug, I'm sorry, I know it's late, I know and I said, "Craig, what's wrong?" And he said, "Water's coming through the light fixture in the great room. It's coming down like a faucet, Doug. I don't know what to do." And I could hear Renee in the background, and I could hear one of the boys crying. And I said the only thing a father can say in that particular kind of moment, which is, "I'm coming. Don't touch the breaker box with wet hands. I'll be there in 15 minutes. And I was in my truck in my pajama bottoms and a work coat before I'd finished the sentence. I found Renee standing in the great room doorway when I came in the front door still dripping, both boys behind her in pajamas, 12 and 9. The younger one crying in that specific scared way kids cry when they can tell the adults around them are scared too. And Renee looked at me and said, "Dad, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. We should have called you in January." And I said, "Renee, we'll talk about January next week. Right now, I need every towel in this house, and I need you to keep those boys out of this room." And something in my voice, the old job site voice I hadn't used in 6 years, straightened her right up, and she had those boys moving before I'd finished the sentence. I want to tell you what I found, because the finding is the whole education. The great room ceiling had a bulge in it the size of a manhole cover, sagging, saturated, water beating through the seams around the recessed light fixture, and running down in a stream Craig had, sensibly, caught in 2 stock pots. And when I got up in that attic space with a flashlight, soaked to the knees within a minute, friend, I found the whole story written in the framing the way Ellery Voss taught me to read a house 58 years ago. The roof valley over that addition had been flashed wrong from the start, cheap step flashing, no proper valley membrane underneath it, sealed with caulk instead of built with lap and lead, which is exactly the kind of shortcut that looks completed on the day of the final walkthrough and fails on the first storm that actually tests it properly. 6 months of slow leaking mostly, before this one storm finally overwhelmed what caulk could hold, had already soaked the sheathing and half the rafters down one whole side, and when I pressed my thumb into that plywood, friend, it went in like wet bread. We got through that night. Tarps, buckets, a wet vac Craig didn't know he owned until I found it in his own garage. And by 3 in the morning, the immediate flood was managed, and everybody was exhausted, and nobody had said one word yet about the sign that used to be in the yard. Craig said it around 4 a.m., sitting at Renee's kitchen table, gray with exhaustion, and I want to give this to him plainly because a man should get credit for the hard sentences same as he gets blamed for the easy ones. He said, "Doug, I called Sterling 3 times this week already. Left messages. Nothing." I said, "Craig, that's usually what happens with an outfit that size once the check's cleared." And he looked at me and he said, "You're the only real contractor I know. And friend," I let that sentence sit in the air a good long while before I answered it, because 6 months earlier those same 4 words, real contractor, had been used to tell me the exact opposite thing, and I wanted him to hear the silence and understand what he'd just done, without me having to spell it out like a school teacher. The next week, I brought Nate Correa out to look at the whole addition properly. Nate apprenticed under me starting in 2009, 17 years old then, 34 now, and he's a licensed structural engineer today, the kind of credential I never chased for myself, because in my day the work spoke for you, and Nate's the closest thing this county has to what I used to be, minus the parts of me that got old-fashioned about paperwork. I remember the first thing I ever taught that boy, on his first day, same as Ellery had taught me. I made him look at a roof for 20 minutes and say nothing, and when he finally asked what he was supposed to be seeing, I told him, "Water, Nate. Everything up here is about where the water wants to go." He was a quick study, quicker than I ever was, and when he told me at 19 that he wanted to go get his engineering degree instead of just staying on as my foreman, I drove him to the community college registration myself and paid the first semester's fee out of my own pocket, because a good apprentice who outgrows you is the finest compliment this trade has to offer. And I wasn't about to let pride get in the way of paying it forward the way Ellery never let his pride get in the way of teaching me. Nate's the one who insisted we pull the permit file, not me, and he's the one who insisted on doing it properly through the county office, instead of just taking Sterling's word for what had been inspected, because, he told me, that's the difference between what you taught me and what these outfits do, Doug. You check the paper against the wall. They just check the paper. He went through that addition top to bottom with a moisture meter and a flashlight and about 90 minutes of increasingly quiet muttering. And what he found, friend, was worse than the roof. The footing tie-in I'd worried about from the road, back in January, had in fact been under-anchored. 4 bolts where code and common sense both call for at least 8 in that soil. And the new slab had already begun a slow separation from the original foundation. Less than a 1/4 inch so far, Nate said, but measurable and moving. Nate pulled Sterling Premier Builder's permit file at the county office 2 days later, out of professional curiosity as much as anything. And this is the detail, friend, that turned my quiet hurt into something closer to plain old grief for what could have happened to my daughter's family. The final footing inspection, the one that's supposed to happen before you're legally allowed to pour concrete over it, had never been called in, not failed, never requested. Somebody at Sterling had poured over an uninspected footing and simply logged the job as passed in their own paperwork. And the county, backlogged the way every county building department in this state is backlogged, had never caught the gap. And Sterling's bond, the one on that glossy yard sign, had lapsed in March, 6 weeks into the job, for non-payment of premium, a fact Chad Sterling's own insurance broker confirmed to Nate over the phone without much apparent embarrassment about it at all. I sat next to Nate in the county records office while he pulled that file. Friend, an ordinary Tuesday morning, fluorescent lights, a clerk named Donna who stamped my own permits for 30 years, and I watched a 34-year-old man I once taught to read a roof go quiet and pale over a manila folder, and he turned it around so I could see the inspection log myself. Footing inspection. Blank, no date, no inspector's initials, just a single stamped word further down the page that said passed, in a font that didn't match anything else in the file. Donna leaned over, looked at it and said, "That's not our stamp, Doug," and went to go get her supervisor. And that, friend, is the exact moment this stopped being a family embarrassment and became something closer to a small-scale crime. I want to tell you something true here, friend, something I've been turning over for a while now, because a story like this one deserves its facts straight, not just its feelings. There's a stretch of history in this country, between about 1908 and 1940, when a company called Sears, the same Sears that used to sell you a wrench and a winter coat, sold roughly 70,000 houses through the mail. Whole homes, shipped by rail in a boxcar full of numbered lumber and an instruction book, assembled by farmers and store clerks and schoolteachers who had never held a level in their life. No license, no bond, no permit most places back then at all. And by the best count historians have managed, something close to 70% of those houses, somewhere around 49,000 of them, are still standing today, still square, still dry, still holding families inside them, better than a century on. Sterling Premier Builders, friend, fully licensed, fully bonded, 5 stars, couldn't build a single roof valley that survived 2.5 inches of rain in 6 months. A permit tells you a man cleared a desk on a particular Tuesday. It has never once in the history of this trade told you whether the man can actually build. I told Craig that fact, sitting at his kitchen table, the week after Nate's report came back, and I watched it land on him the way a true thing lands on an honest man, which is slowly, and with real cost to his pride, and he sat with his coffee going cold and he said, "So my father-in-law's truck was the safest bid I had the whole time." And I said, "Craig, I'm not going to pretend that doesn't feel good to hear. But I'd rather you'd said it to me in January than have Renee and the boys sleep under a ceiling that was already failing for 6 months before either of us knew it." Here's where I'll tell you honestly that this isn't a revenge story, because I don't much care for those, and it isn't the story I'd have told if it were. Sterling Premier Builders' bond lapse meant Craig's insurance claim against them was worth exactly nothing, and a lawyer would have cost more than the repair. And I want you to know plainly that I did not take satisfaction in that fact, not the way you might expect an old man to. What I felt mostly, watching Craig work through the numbers at that kitchen table, was the specific tiredness of watching somebody learn, the expensive way, a lesson you'd have handed them for free if they'd only asked. I fixed it myself. 6 weeks, straight through the rest of July and into September by the time we were done. Me and Nate and one good young carpenter Nate trusts, tearing the whole roof valley and half the great room ceiling back to the rafters, reflashing it the way Ellery Voss taught me in 1969. Lead and lap. No shortcuts. Drying and treating the soaked framing that could be saved and replacing what couldn't. And pouring a proper supplemental footing under that separating slab with Nate's stamped engineering behind it. And this time, an inspector who actually climbed down into the trench before we poured. I was up on that roof myself most mornings, 76 years old, Carol standing at the bottom of the ladder same as she has for 52 years, saying the same thing she said every single time. "Don't you dare hurry on my account, Douglas Marsh." And I moved slower than I did at 40, friend. I won't pretend otherwise. My knees told me about every one of those 6 weeks in a language with no ambiguity in it at all. But slow and right has always beaten fast and wrong in this trade, and it beat it again. Craig showed up most evenings after his own work, in old clothes, handing up shingles and holding the far end of the lead flashing while I formed it. Clumsy at first the way he'd been clumsy on Renee's treehouse platform 23 years earlier. And by the third week, he could cut a piece of step, flashing clean enough that I let him do the whole north slope himself under my eye. And I want you to know, friend, that watching my son-in-law learn to do one small piece of this work properly, with his own hands, did more to mend what sterling premier builders broke than any apology he could have handed me across a kitchen table. I charged Craig for materials and for Nate's engineering fee, because a man should be allowed to pay an honest debt. It's part of how he gets to keep his dignity. But I didn't charge him $1 for my own labor, and when he tried to argue about that, I told him the same thing I'd told Renee 23 years before, the day I built her a treehouse for free. Family rate, Craig. It's the only rate I've got left in me at 76, and it happens to be the best one I ever offered anybody. Chad Sterling's operation, I should tell you, didn't last the year. Word travels in a county this size, friend, faster than any five-star review campaign can outrun it. And between our job and, it turned out, 2 others the county building office started quietly scrutinizing that same summer. A bathroom addition out on Millbrook Road with the same forged inspection stamp. And a garage conversion 2 towns over where a support beam had been sized off the wrong span table entirely. Sterling Premier Builders let its truck sit in a lot off Route 9 by October. Vinyl wraps peeling in the weather, phone disconnected. A for sale sign zip-tied to the fence around the yard where the equipment used to be. Donna at the records office told me, next time I was in for an unrelated permit, that the state contractors board had pulled Chad Sterling's license entirely in November, and that 2 of his own former framing crew had gone to work, of all places, for Nate, who'd started taking on small jobs himself that fall using exactly the standards I taught him, and none of the shortcuts Sterling had taught them. I take no pleasure in a man's business folding. I take considerable, quiet satisfaction in the fact that it folded on the truth, and not on anything I did to hurry it along. Craig said the real thing to me in September on the porch of the finished edition, dry now, tested by 2 more good storms since, and he didn't dress it up, which I respected. He said, "Doug, I was embarrassed of your truck. That's the whole ugly reason, under all the licensing talk. I didn't want my neighbors seeing my wife's father show up in a 20-year-old Ford to build my addition, and I dressed that shame up as a business decision. And it cost us $238,000, and then another $41,000 to do it right. And it nearly cost us a lot more than money on the night that ceiling came down. I'm sorry." And I told him what I'll tell you now, friend, because I think it's the truest thing this whole story taught me. A man's truck tells you what he can afford. It's never once told anybody what he can build. Renee cried when Craig said that part to her later. She told me, and not from anger, from relief, because she said she'd known the real reason all along and had been waiting 2 years for her husband to be brave enough to say it out loud instead of hiding it inside a fact about insurance bonds. Craig did one more thing that fall that I didn't ask for and wouldn't have thought to ask for. He brought me to the County Builders Association mixer that October, the same event where I'd shaken Chad Sterling's rehearsed handshake back in the spring. And when somebody, making conversation, asked how the addition project had gone, Craig didn't let me answer first the way I'd expected him to out of politeness. He said we hired the wrong outfit to start, cost us a lot of money and nearly cost us a lot more. And then my father-in-law, Doug Marsh, fixed it properly. And if any of you are planning anything on your own house, you call him before you call anybody with a bigger marketing budget than years in the trade. There were maybe 30 people in that room, friend, and I've built things for a good number of them over 5 decades, and not one of them looked surprised, which told me they'd always known what Craig had needed 6 months and a flooded ceiling to finally say out loud. We had Thanksgiving out on that addition this year, first holiday in the finished room, and Craig stood up before the meal, which he has never once done in 25 years of Thanksgivings, and he said, "I want to thank my father-in-law for this room, and for a lot of other things I was too proud to see clearly until a ceiling fell on me, and everybody laughed, the good kind of laugh." And Renee squeezed my hand under the table, and my grandson Micah, the 12-year-old, piped up and said, "Grandpa, will you teach me to do the roof thing, the flashing?" And I said, "Son, I taught your Uncle Nate and I taught your father a little of it this summer, and I've got a few years left in these hands yet. So yes, I imagine I will." And Renee looked at me across that table with an expression I'd only seen on her mother's face before, and I understood, sitting there, that this whole ugly 6 months had ended up handing 3 generations of this family the exact same lesson at once, which is about as efficient as grief ever gets. I looked up at that valley I reflashed with my own 2 hands, lead and lap, no shortcuts, and I thought about Ellery Voss, dead 11 years now, who used to say a house doesn't lie to you. It just waits until you're not looking to tell you the truth. Neither, it turns out, does a family. You just have to be patient enough and old enough and quiet enough to let the roof do the talking. It's evening here now. Carol's got the porch light on, same as always, and out past the fence line I can see the addition roof line against the last of the sky, holding steady through a light rain that's just started up, the good ordinary kind. The kind of roof is supposed to shrug off without anybody in the house even noticing. My phone hasn't rung with an emergency since that storm in July, and I've decided that's the best kind of quiet a builder can ask for. So if you take one thing from an old man's 52 years in this trade, take this. A license tells you what a man's allowed to do. It's never once told you what he's actually built. Look for the man whose work is still standing 20 years on, whose word held up longer than his warranty did, and don't let the truck fool you either way, the flashy one or the old one. Judge the roof, friend, always the roof. It's the only part of any of us that never learned how to lie. And the porch light's on. It always is. If this story found you somewhere quiet tonight, stay a while. There's a new one on this porch every week, and the light's on for you too. This has been the Porch Light. This story, like all stories told here, is an original work of fiction. Any resemblance to real persons is coincidental. Good night, friend. Drive safe going home.